and Gentiles. As you're thinking about the book of Romans, be mindful that, I think Paul is really emphasizing, too, the unity that they have in Christ. Understanding the challenges that Jews and Gentiles had during the first century and before all that, he's really emphasizing who they are and that there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile when it comes to the gospel. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17 is really the launching pad. And I keep going back to this text because we're going to be reading more about the righteousness of God. So Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. We've been seeing this idea, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. And so he's going to be emphasizing the righteousness of God. And when you look at that word, it has the same root as the word justice. And so we talked about the righteousness of God. It can be the divine characteristics of God. It's the manner in which he conducts himself in all things. And as we'll see in chapter 3, he is just, and he is also the justifier. He's just by nature and justifier through the plan enacted by the faithfulness in Christ, in which those who are justified believe. And it can also be referring to the state of one being declared just or right by God. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here. We're going to see the impartiality of God when it comes to both Jew and Gentile, and how we can be declared right by God through the blood of Jesus Christ. I just want to read something here to you. I've been doing some more reading on this, looking at this term of righteousness. Let me just read this to you. It says, the biblical idea of God's justice is that he'll put all the wrongs of the world, put right all the wrongs of the world. He promised to do this in a covenant he made long ago to Abraham and his family, a promise ultimately realized in Abraham's great descendant, Jesus. Jewish readers would understand righteousness referring to God's own faithfulness to his promises to Israel, to his covenant. He keeps his word and thereby shows his trustworthiness, justice, and righteousness. This word righteousness comes from the Jewish courts, in which there are three parties, the judge, the plaintiff, and the defendant. There's no prosecuting attorney, no jury. Each party makes his case to the judge, who is called on to be impartial, to punish wrongdoing and support the defenseless. A judge who acts in this way shows his righteousness, his faithfulness in upholding the covenant. And when the judge finds in favor of either the plaintiff or the defendant, that party is declared righteous. Not necessarily morally good and deserving of a favorable outcome, but one who is given the status by the court of being in the right as a result of the judge's decision. And I think that may help us out a little bit when we think about the righteousness of God and how we can be declared right in the sight of God through Jesus Christ. And so we looked at that in Romans chapter 1. Paul is going to preach the gospel to both Jews and to the Gentiles. And it's interesting, too, in verse 14 of Romans 1, he said, I'm under obligation both to Greeks and to the barbarians. And you kind of see that distinction, how the Greeks viewed everyone else. And now Paul's going to be emphasizing how the gospel is for everyone. There was another distinction, Jew and Gentile, or Jew and the other nations. And so he's going to be emphasizing in this book that the gospel, it is for all. And so we emphasize that in Romans chapter 1. We see the need for the gospel. When you look at Romans 1, 18 through 32, with how the Gentiles have lived in times past. And certainly there's great application both in the first century and now, how people suppress the truth. They were described as having a depraved mind in Romans chapter 1 and verse number 28 through 32. And so we see the need for salvation in Jesus Christ because all have sinned. Romans chapter 2, Paul is going to also address the Jewish audience, and that it's not just Gentiles who are in need of salvation. It's not just Gentiles who have sinned. It is also Jews. They also stand condemned. I mentioned in the last class, and I just want to quickly look at these, the mentality that some of the Jewish people had. Did everybody have this mentality? I don't think so. But there was a mentality that the Jewish people had, whether it was John the Baptist addressing some of the people in his audience, how they often would say, we have Abraham for our father. They emphasize Father Abraham and circumcision, which Paul is going to address, the temple, and they said, they had this mentality, we are God's people, we're secure, and yet Paul is going to help them to see, well, wait a second, you too have stubborn hearts, and you too are in need of repentance. And so we looked at a number of these passages here where you can see the mindset of some of the Jews in the first century, whether Luke 18 or John 8 when Jesus was teaching them. And they said, look, we've never been under bondage. And so this is a problem that Paul is going to be addressing in this letter. And so those are just some examples here. Acts 10 and Acts chapter 11, I think, is a great example with Peter going to the house of Cornelius and how hard that was and the response of his Jewish brethren. And obviously Acts chapter 15. So making sure you have that background information becomes really important. So we looked at all of that in Romans chapter 2. Look at the last part of Romans chapter 2 in verse 26 through 29, or actually verses 25 through 29, as Paul continues his thought. And remember, he uses this device, or this rhetorical device, a diatribe, where he's going to be anticipating arguments that someone may have, and you clearly see that as he's talking about Jews and circumcision. He said in verse 25, "For indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision." So we talked about that and how the Jews placed great value on circumcision, and that was from God. And yet Paul is trying to drive home a bigger point. What was he trying to drive home in those last few verses of chapter 2 as he spoke about circumcision with respect to Jews and Gentiles? What was the main point that he was trying to drive home? This is important as we get into chapter 3. What was it? That's right, yeah. You can focus so much on the flesh, but God has always been after circumcision of the heart, right? And those who are going to follow him, that's what he desires. And that is who he is going to praise. And so there's such focus on the outer part, and they had missed what God wanted them to see. This idea of being a Jew now was not about the outward, but more about the inward. So circumcision is about the heart, not the flesh. And so the flesh, the circumcision, law, those are all things that were related to the ethnic Israel. And now he's emphasizing, we need to make sure that our hearts are circumcised. And this is going to be the distinction now. And so when you think about what Paul has said, for a Jewish person or audience who may be listening to this or reading this, wow, what's Paul getting after here? And this is why he begins chapter 3. I don't know about you if you had any difficulties with chapter 3, the first 8 verses. I had to read it a few times and then a few more times. But Paul is doing something here. And he's driving to Romans 3, the latter part, where he's going to make it very clear that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And that when it comes to salvation, it's not going to come through the law of Moses. But when it comes to justification, it's going to come through Jesus Christ. So let's look at verse number 1. And here's what I did. I put this in my Bible. And let's look at the first 8 verses, and then we can talk about this some. In Romans 1 and verse 3, Paul says, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision?" So we know that Paul is speaking here. And this is how I kind of outlined it for myself to understand who's talking and what's going on. So verse number 1, what was the advantage? What advantage did the Jew have? What was the benefit of circumcision? You guys help me out with this. We got to move fast tonight. What was it? What was the advantage? What was the benefit?
Oracles of God, the word of God.
Yeah, they were given the prophets, the oracles of God. That's what he said in verse 2. And so he answers this question. He said, great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God, and so they were given something special. They were given the revelation from God. And there's something else interesting there too. This idea of them being entrusted. The very words that they were given, those words were proclaiming the coming Messiah, pointing to someone greater. And obviously, many of them missed that. But they were given the very words of God. So look at verse 3. Verse 3, he says, "What then, if some do not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it?" So I believe he's speaking as if someone is responding to what he's already said. Does that make sense? Is that how you guys read that? And then in verse number 4, he's going to respond by saying, "May it never be. Rather let God be true, though every man be found a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged." And so I think what he's showing us here, what he's saying here, someone going to respond by saying, well, is God no longer faithful? You said all these things about circumcision now being of no value, that we're going to be judged, and potentially condemned, just like the Jew or the Gentiles. And so he's going back and forth with this diatribe, answering these potential objections. And so I think that's what he's getting at in verse number 3. This idea, maybe some were thinking, is God no longer faithful? Is he not going to fulfill all the things that he said that he would do? And what Paul is answering in verse 4, Paul is going to remind them, listen, God has always been faithful in everything that he does. And I think that's where we also see his righteousness, that he's always been faithful. Yes, sir.
When they were unfaithful, when the children were unfaithful, but was always willing to take them back when they repented and turned back to him.
That's right. Amen. Yeah, he punished them in times past, and we talked about that too. The book of Ezekiel, the challenge that the Jews had, or at least so many of them, they would say in Ezekiel, God is not right. You're not right with what you're doing. And it seems like that's what he's even going after too in these first 8 verses. He's going to eliminate any argument that they could have when it comes to the fact, helping them to see, if you don't do what is right in the eyes of God, you're going to be condemned as well. And justification is not going to come through the law. Does that make sense? Those first 4 verses? All right, now look at the last part of verse number 4 here. He says, he quotes from, where is he quoting from, the last part of verse 4? Psalm 51. Stu, what do you think is the significance of him quoting from Psalm 51? What's going on in Psalm 51?
David's psalm that he wrote after being approached by Nathan and condemned for his sin, and he's telling God that he was condemned, and his sin was always before him, and only God was righteous in his judgment.
Yeah, I think he's getting at something there. David recognized that, his judgment, what God would do, it was just and fair. He recognized his own sin, his own behavior, and maybe that's why Paul is quoting this. He says, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. And that's certainly emphasizing God, that he's going to be fair. And just even King David recognized that God would be fair and was fair in all that he did. And so someone else had mentioned, just doing a lot of reading on this, maybe he used this example of King David. David had committed, what had he committed? Adultery, right? And remember back in murder, I forgot, adultery and murder. And remember back in chapter 2 and verse 22, someone said, maybe he's going kind of back there. He said, you who say that you should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? And so you got King David, who everyone loves, and he's reminding them, listen, it's easy to look at somebody else, but you guys have done many of the same things. Look at verse number 5. Paul says, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? I am speaking in human terms. May it never be. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? And why not say, as we are slanderously reported, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come, their condemnation is just. So I just grouped all of this together. And the point I think Paul is making, remember he's using this diatribe. So he's anticipating these arguments, anticipating what someone may be thinking as he is rolling out the gospel of Jesus Christ and the righteousness of God. And so what I think he's saying here, in this mindset that some had, if the Jews' unrighteousness highlighted God's righteousness, should they continue in sin that grace may abound? Well, we know the answer to that. That's pretty silly, right? You would never want to do something like that. And so he's just taken away these potential thoughts that many of the Jewish people may have had as he's talking about the fact, listen, both Jews and Gentiles stand condemned before God. In verse 5, when he says, I am speaking in human terms, I think he's just referring to the argument that he's laying out and how this argument is being used by people. And so what he's emphasizing is, God is going to be fair and just. He's going to judge the world. And it also appears that some may have been, we already know that there were those who were opposed to Paul and speaking bad about what he was teaching. And I think this is also connecting us to Romans chapter 6. This idea, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? And Paul's going to say, no, God forbid. And so what he's doing here, I believe he's just answering potential arguments or this mindset that some of the Jewish people may have had, especially as they are hearing him say, Gentiles stand condemned, Jews also stand condemned, all have sinned. All right? So in your workbook, let me see here, on page number 13, that was really the first two questions. And so verse 9 has helped me to understand what is he driving at here. If you understand verse 1 in chapter 3 is connecting back up to chapter 2, he's making sure, listen, there was great benefit in circumcision. This was from God. There's great benefit in receiving the oracles of God. But at the same time, you have to understand that God is going to be just and he's going to judge everyone. And that's why he concludes this section in verse 9 where he says, what then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. And so he's beginning to wrap up this argument that he's laying out, that everybody's under sin, and that all have sinned and come short of the grace of God, or glory of God. Let me stop here. Questions? Thoughts? Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So I asked you guys this past Sunday verses 10 through 18, and this really looks at question number 3. What is going on, and what is Paul doing in verses 10 through 18? He's laid out this argument in the first 8 verses. Jews, you're not going to escape the judgment of God either. God has always been faithful. Now, what is he going after? What's he trying to do in verses 10 through 18? Let's open it up. What do you think? Who's got something? Anyone? Oh, sorry, brother.
He's using the Old Testament to illustrate the point that sin abounds. Throughout the ages, throughout all these Old Testament writings, the Jews put their confidence in. It just illustrates the prevalence of sin.
It makes sense. They have become useless. There's none who does good. There's not even one. So we don't have time to read all of the Psalms. He's quoting from numerous Psalms. He's quoting in these verses here from Psalm 14, 1 through 3, and I would encourage you to read them if you haven't, and Psalm 53, verses 1 through 3. And one of the things that's interesting, as you go back and read many of these Psalms, you see this mindset. The fool has said, there is no God. And that I just kept thinking about Romans chapter 1, how the Gentiles, what did they do? They would often suppress the truth, right? And they would push God away, even though they had all of this evidence. So when you look at Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, what is being emphasized in those two Psalms is that the fool says there is no God. He does what is evil. And it's interesting, at the end of those Psalms, the psalmist emphasizes that God is with the righteous and will restore the fortunes of his people. So maybe there's even a little hint of what's to come. But he's certainly emphasizing in those Psalms the wickedness of man. And so that's something interesting there. And Paul, again, he's driving at a point. He's not just kind of randomly picking these Psalms. In verse number 13, look at what he said here in verse number 13. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of apes is under their lips. And so what Psalms? Oh, I already gave away the answer. It's already on the slide. All right, so we all got that. I was going to ask, what Psalms is he talking about? Psalm chapter 5 and Psalm chapter 140. So when you read Psalm chapter 5, what the psalmist is emphasizing is that evil can't dwell with God, that he hates all evildoers, and yet he's going to end the psalm by talking about, let all who take refuge in you be glad, for you bless the righteous. And so there's even that hint of this idea of righteousness and God being with those who will do what's right. Psalm chapter 140, when you read that, the psalmist asks for deliverance from evil men who plan wicked things. They are a poison to society. And at the end of that psalm, he concludes by saying, I know the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and will execute justice for the needy. Surely the righteous shall give thanks to your name. The upright shall dwell in your presence. So it's really interesting, the psalms that he's using. One, he's using these to a Jewish audience, which they would have been aware of. Two, they're all emphasizing the problem of sin that he's going after as well. And three, you're also seeing the righteousness of God. Look at verse 14. Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. I won't put up the next verse or the next point. Where is he quoting from in verse 14? What'd you say? Yeah, Psalm 10. Do you guys get that? Psalm 10 and verse 7. So again, he's going slowly through this whole argument, and he's going to wrap it up by the time we get to the end of chapter 3. In Psalm chapter 10, the psalmist is asking why the Lord is so far away, while the wicked destroy the poor. They boast in their ungodliness and say there is no God. I've learned something just going through Romans chapter 3, just how often that phrase, there is no God, is found in the Psalms. It's amazing how I always think about Psalm 14 and verse number 1. But this is something that is emphasized throughout the book of Psalms. And so it's the idea in Psalm 10 that the wicked believe they're not going to be held accountable. But that's not going to be the case. And we see that God is going to help those who are helpless, and he's going to bring about justice and strengthen the afflicted. So there's something going on with these Psalms when you really start diving into them and start reading them, because he's using all of these to really drive home his point that Jew and Gentile alike are going to be condemned. And then verses 15 through 17, where does he come from next? Or where does he quote next? What does he quote? Isaiah chapter 59. You guys know the first two verses of Isaiah chapter 59? Anyone? I used to use it. I still use them in sermon. Look at Isaiah chapter 59. Go back there real quickly. And one of the things that has just really fascinated me with this study, guys, think about all of the Old Testament passages Paul has used. We're only in Romans chapter 3. The Psalms. He's talking about King David. Now he's using Isaiah. And what I want to emphasize, we're not under the old law, right? We're not under the law of Moses. We're under a better covenant. And yet the Old Testament is so valuable for us in our Bible study. And we see how Paul is just going to continue to use this as he makes his point. So I'm saying all of that because I think it's just good for us to make sure that we continue to study from the Old Testament, because it certainly will help us in the New. In Isaiah 59, he said in verse 1, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it cannot save, nor his ear so dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he does not hear. Your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken falsehood, your tongue mutters wickedness." So this is God here speaking to his people, and how their sins had separated them from him. And so you read the rest of Isaiah chapter 59. Isaiah is going to emphasize how justice is far from the people. There's no peace, and God sees this horrible condition. Look at verse 16 in Isaiah 59. He saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. He put on righteousness like a breastplate. And so you read verses 16 through 21, and we see how God is going to begin to intervene. And certainly this made me think about the righteousness of God. This is what Isaiah is talking about his righteousness and what he's going to do. And so all of these examples that he's using, when you go back to Romans chapter 3, he's using these for a reason. And he is certainly, as Kyle mentioned, he's speaking about the wicked behavior, certainly of both Jew and Gentiles. And Paul is using this to show them how bad their situation really is. And really think about this too. You know, Paul is driving this home. The first 3 chapters here are kind of dark, because he's showing them just how bad off people really are, both Jew and Gentile. And so he just continues to really push this point. Then in verse 18, he says, "There's no fear of God before their eyes." Where is he quoting from here? Psalm 36, yeah. So Psalm 36 and verse number 1. So when you read Psalm chapter 36, it's the idea that the evil exalt themselves, and certainly is similar to other passages, and God will act justly for the upright in heart. So that's the first 18 verses. Let's pause. Any comments, questions, disagreements? Yes, ma'am.
Another big thing that Paul is driving across is that God is the same. From the Old Testament to the New Testament, he shows when he talks about circumcision, God always cared about the heart. And then he shows that with Psalm 51, because like we always think of that psalm as the one that says, create in me a clean heart, O God. So it's showing God has always cared about the heart here, and he cares about it now. Some of the commandments about salvation are different because of the new law, but the underlying concepts that God has always cared about the heart and that everyone has fallen short, as shown by these verses, are the same. So he's connecting that in their minds to it. This is why all these verses are there, to show you that God is the same.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. God is the same, and he deals with man appropriately. He's going to deal with man properly. Excellent point. And there's something, I think, really powerful about that, too, just really diving into the text. Certainly we can read this, but go back, if you haven't read those Psalms, go back and read those Psalms, because what you just mentioned, Trinae, is something really powerful, and we can learn a lot about God. Romans is teaching me a lot about God, and it's helping me to see how God deals with man. Certainly it is about the gospel, and we think about salvation and evangelism and things like that, but we see who God is, and we see how he deals with man. Yes, ma'am?
Thinking verse 10 through 18, not only is it interesting in bringing in all these passages from Psalms and Isaiah, but what stands out to me is basically the whole essence of man here. There's no part of them that's righteous, right? And we're all under sin. And it's interesting how verse 10 and 11, he's talking about the mind. They don't understand. They turn aside, and then he switches over, to verse 13, their throat, their tongue, their lips. Verse 14, their mouth. The 15, their feet. Then he goes on to their paths, and then he goes on to their eyes. Their whole, to me, it just stands out. It's their whole body, their whole essence, their minds, their bodies. There's nothing righteous. We're all under sin. And so it's just fascinating how he brings it all together.
Yeah, really bringing it all together. And that's one of the questions, too. When you get to verse 23, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. What's he emphasizing when he says all have sinned? When he says all, who is he referring to? I see some lips moving. All people? Yeah. So it's important, though, to emphasize who are the two main groups that he's been talking about? Jews and Gentiles. That's a theme that you got to hold on to as we go throughout the book, especially like when you get to chapters 9, 10, 11. He's going to be making this argument about Jews and Gentiles. Now, some, unfortunately, have abused some of these scriptures. Is Paul teaching that we are born in sin? He's not teaching that, right? That's going down that path of Calvinism. Some have also gone to, when we get to verse 23, all have sinned. Well, they say, well, see, he's talking about even babies. See, babies are born with sin. All have sinned. That's not in the context. So remember, even as we're looking at this, that he's emphasizing to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And he's talking about people who are at an age where they can suppress the truth and deny God. And so making sure we understand that becomes really important. Excellent comments. Any other comments, thoughts? Yes, sir?
That where the Bible works, God, or Jesus says to the little kid, there brings the little kids to him and tells people that unless you become like these little children, you're not going to heaven.
That's right.
Sure not, you don't.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so making sure, unfortunately, Romans has been, abused quite a bit, even with the idea of faith and faith alone. And what you saw, what we see in Romans chapter 2, God has always wanted his people to do his will. All right, let's look at verse number 19. And let's see here. What time is it? Okay, we got time. Look at verse 19, and let's just read the last part. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed, and all the world may be accountable to God. Because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, for all those who believe, for there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So let's continue on here, and let's go back and look at verse number 19 and verse number 20. We know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. My understanding is he's talking about the law of Moses, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God, because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So he's certainly helping us to see, and let me read something to you, looking at some background information. I think this is pertaining to where he says, so that every mouth may be closed. It's been said that in Paul's world, if you were on trial and had nothing more to say in your defense, you put your hand over your mouth as a sign. Sometimes court officials would strike the prisoner on the mouth to indicate that their mouths should be stopped. In other words, that they were obviously guilty and should not be attempting to defend themselves. And I thought that's interesting that he's wrapping all this up. And what's he saying? You're guilty too. Yeah, you're circumcised and you got the law, but you're guilty too. And when it comes to being justified by the law, are men going to be justified by the law of Moses? It's not going to happen. And if you're looking to be made right with God through the law of Moses, the law does not justify. It holds man accountable to God. It helps him to understand sin. But no man is going to be justified by the works of the law. And so I think that's what he's talking about there in verse number 19 and 20. And the works of the law there, talking about the works of the law of Moses, which would entail all of those things that the law spoke about. So being a Jew and having the marks of a Jew will not justify anyone. And so he's wrapping all this up and helping them to see you stand condemned just before God as well. Does that make sense? Okay. So verse number 21, he says in verse number 22, but now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So now we're starting to get to the good stuff here. What's he saying in verse number 21? But now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. What's he driving at here, guys? What's the point he's trying to make? What do you think?
Besides or beyond the law and prophets. And it was from the beginning that God is the authority, and he had this plan, and it entailed the law and the prophets, but it wasn't going to end there.
Yeah, and the law and the prophets, that's good. Anyone else? Any other comments? Yeah, he's driving at something here. Apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and prophets. Let me just see what I have on my notes here. He's helping us to see ultimately that God's righteousness is going to come through who? Is it going to come through the law of Moses? It's going to come through Jesus, the Messiah. And certainly the prophets had spoken of the coming Messiah, and that's what he's driving at, because when you get to chapter 4, we're going to talk about Father Abraham. And so this is where it gets really exciting. He's got to help the Jewish people to see that righteousness now is going to come through faith in Jesus Christ. And so, if righteousness was only going to be for the Jews, then God wasn't going to be fair. He wouldn't be fair. But he's going to be fair to all men, both Jew and Gentile alike. And so verse 21 and verse 22, I think, are really powerful. He says in verse 22, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all those who believe, for there is no distinction. So the point that he's driving home is that, God's plan is ultimately now being revealed in Jesus Christ. I read something here in verse 22, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus. Some have translated this faithfulness of Jesus. Maybe he's making a point here how Israel was not faithful, yet Jesus and all the things that he did for the Father, he was faithful. The point that he's making, though, the righteousness of God, how God is going to make man right, justified, is going to come through Jesus Christ. And so verse 23, he says in the last part of verse 22, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so all men are going to be in need of Jesus Christ. And this justification is not going to come through the keeping of the law of Moses. So did you guys have any other thoughts? That was question number 4. What is meant by his righteousness in verses 24 through 26. Let's read that here real quickly. He says, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God he passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So the question on page number 14, what is meant by his righteousness? That's actually looking at verses 24 through 26. How'd you guys sum that up? What's meant by this idea of righteousness?
When I read that, I think about God's faithfulness to keep his promise, and how that in spite of the sin of man, which condemned man to death, the penalty for sin, that God could remain true to his word through Christ. Christ be paying that penalty, being the sacrifice sufficient to take away man's sin.
Yeah, God is always going to be faithful to his word. He's able to justify people through Christ. A penalty had to be paid, right? And he is that propitiation. I think that's right. Yes, sir.
The offering of Christ was for the purpose of demonstrating his righteousness, his faithfulness, his truthfulness. He's going to keep his promises. And it also shows just how terrible sin is. And in order for God to be righteous and keep his promises, he had to sacrifice his own son.
Yeah, it really is powerful. And we're kind of going quickly through this, but you're exactly right. Through Jesus, we see the righteousness of God, and a penalty had to be paid. And through Christ, we are justified. That's how we're going to be declared right in the sight of God. And verse 25 and 26 are powerful. Whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. We don't use that word propitiation that often in our everyday conversations. But what Stu and Kyle here are mentioning, it's helping us to see this sacrifice that Jesus would make. When you go back, I believe it's Exodus chapter 25, verses 17 and 18. You see this idea of, what is it here? The mercy seat, I believe. Let me just take a quick look at this, make sure I got this right. In Exodus chapter 25 and verses 17 and 18. Yeah, you should make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. So you see the mercy seat here, and reading up on this in verses 25 and 26, what Stu mentioned, this idea of Christ becoming this sacrifice. You see some references, I think, with what will be taking place in the temple. He's going to be put forth. He's going to be presented, and he's going to be as a propitiation or the place of mercy. So in the Old Testament, this mercy seat, it was the center of God's presence in the Holy of Holies, in the blood or death of the sacrificed animal for atonement of sins, and that this was the place where God's wrath was appeased. That's my understanding with that, and you guys fact check me. This is how God could be just and the justifier at the same time. He had to deal with sin. He couldn't just overlook sin. Sin had to be dealt with, and he just couldn't ignore it. And so Jesus is that mercy seat or that propitiation where God offers grace and mercy to man. And so I think that's what he's driving at here in verses 25 and 26. Of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So this is really good news. Our justification, becoming right with God, it happens only through Jesus Christ. And it's not going to come through the law of Moses. We need to stop here. Let me ask you, are there any comments or questions? Does that make sense with what I just mentioned? All right. If it doesn't, we'll go over it again on Sunday. I want to make sure that I'm clear with that because what Paul is emphasizing here, you're seeing this shift. He's already made the point, all have sinned. He's made it very clear, Jew and Gentile. Now he's really driving home, the good news. And the good news is that we all can be made right in or through Jesus Christ. So we'll stop here. If you guys have questions, please let me know. Look at the next part in the workbook and read Romans chapter 4. And I also put in the workbook, it may be good for you to go back and read Genesis 12 through 22. Somebody says, man, Genesis 12 through 22, that's a lot of chapters. It is, but read it. Because I think it will help us to understand even more about Abraham, as Paul is now going to talk about Abraham and our faith like Abraham. So if you have questions or comments, please let me know. We'll stop here. Thank you.